Look at the ground beneath your feet. Now imagine peeling back the layers of grass, concrete, and topsoil like a blanket. Go deeper, past the last few centuries of frantic construction, past the colonial era, past the moment of first contact. What do you expect to find? Arrowheads? Pottery shards? The scattered remains of a few nomadic camps? That is the story we're told. A vast empty continent, a pristine wilderness sparsely populated by tribes living in harmony with nature. Except that's not what's actually there. Beneath our cities and farms lies the ghost of another world. A world of sprawling metropolises, of pyramids larger than geysers, and of geometric earthworks so vast you can only grasp their scale from the sky. We see ourselves as the builders, the architects of this land. But we were not the first, and we may not have been the most ambitious. This isn't just a historical curiosity. This is evidence of a lost chapter of North America, and it completely rewrites the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And if you're using this video to relax, perfect. That's exactly what it's for. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love checking those. It's wild seeing London at sunrise, New York at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching at the same time. Tonight, we're going on a journey into that lost world. We will fly over the incomprehensible geometries of the Ohio Valley, stand at the base of a forgotten pyramid city on the Mississippi, and walk the impossibly straight roads of a civilization that mastered the desert sun. We are not just looking at ruins, we are looking at a profound, continent-spanning mystery. Who were these people? What kind of science, what kind of mathematics, what kind of social organization did it take to build on this mind-blowing scale? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why have their stories been so completely and perhaps deliberately erased? Let's begin where the mystery is perhaps most elegant and most baffling. We're in southern Ohio. From the ground you might not notice much. A series of rolling tree-covered hills, low earthen ridges, maybe a strangely flat clearing. It's easy to dismiss. It's easy to walk right over it and see nothing but landscape. But take to the air, climb a few thousand feet, and the ground resolves into something impossible. Perfect circles, 1,000 feet in diameter. A massive, flawless octagon connected by a narrow causeway to one of the circles. Precise squares, each one enclosing exactly 20 acres. These are not natural formations, they are architecture. This is the Newark earthworks. It is just one of hundreds of similar complexes that once dotted the landscape of the American Midwest. Built by a culture archaeologists call the Hopewell, these structures are a testament to an intelligence that is deeply alien to our modern sensibilities. They possessed no writing that we can decipher. They had no wheel. They had no draft animals. They did not use metal for construction. Their tools were made of stone, wood, and bone. And yet, they engineered these landscapes with a precision that would challenge a modern survey crew. Think about that for a moment. To lay out a perfect circle over 1,000 feet across on uneven forested terrain, you need a fixed center point and a consistent radius. That's simple enough. But the Newark earthworks demonstrate something far more complex. The unit of measurement used to construct them, a length archaeologists have dubbed the Hopewell foot, is repeated with breathtaking accuracy across multiple sites separated by hundreds of miles. They were working from a shared, standardized blueprint. This wasn't a local tribe building a ceremonial mound. This was a coordinated, intellectual tradition, a school of architecture and engineering that spanned a region the size of modern-day France. But here is where the mystery deepens. These structures are not just geometrically perfect, they are astronomical observatories. The Great Hopewell Road, a 60-mile-long raised earthen avenue connecting the Newark Works to another complex at Chillicothe, is aligned perfectly to the northernmost rising of the moon. The sides of the Great Octagon at Newark are not arbitrary. They are aligned to the major and minor standstill points of the moon's 18.6-year cycle. This isn't astrology. This is a staggering feat of long-term observation and predictive celestial mechanics. These people were tracking the subtle, complex dance of the cosmos and embedding that knowledge directly into the Earth itself. They were creating a machine to watch the sky. Who were they? We call them Hopewell, but that is our name, not theirs. It's the name of the farmer on whose land the first major site was excavated. Of their language, their beliefs, their social structure, we know almost nothing. They are a ghost culture, defined only by the monumental structures they left behind and the astonishing artifacts found within them. Buried in their mounds, we find objects that shatter the picture of an isolated people. Sheets of mica, intricately cut into animal and human forms from the Blue Ridge Mountains, hundreds of miles to the east. Conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, 1,000 miles to the south. Obsidian volcanic glass chipped into razor-sharp blades. From Wyoming, 1,500 miles to the west. Copper hammered into breastplates and ceremonial axes from the shores of Lake Superior, far to the north. This was not a simple collection of tribes. This was the hub of a continent-wide network of trade and communication. It was a cultural and economic powerhouse that drew resources from every corner of the known world. It was a civilization. And yet, around the year 500 AD, it simply vanishes. The monumental construction stops. The trade networks collapse. The people seem to melt back into the landscape, leaving behind their silent, geometric ghosts for us to puzzle over. There was no sign of invasion, no great plague we can identify. It was a silent, inexplicable collapse. And the scale of their works would not be matched in North America for another 500 years. To find the next chapter in this story, we must travel west to the fertile floodplain of the Mississippi River, directly across from modern-day St. Louis. Here, starting around 1050 AD, something unprecedented happened. An explosion of culture. A true city rose from the earth, a metropolis that, at its peak, was larger and more populous than London was at the same time. We call it Cahokia. Cahokia was a city of pyramids, not the pointed stone pyramids of Egypt, but massive, four-sided, flat-topped earthen mounds. Over 120 of them were built, organised around a central grand plaza that sprawled over 40 acres. At the heart of the city stood the largest of them all, a structure we now call Monk's Mound. It remains the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, and one of the largest in the world. Its base is larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises in 4 terraces to a height of 100 feet, and on its summit stood a massive building, perhaps a temple, or the residence of a ruler, that was itself the size of a modern cathedral. The sheer scale of this undertaking is almost impossible to comprehend. Monk's Mound alone contains an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth. Every single basketful of that dirt was carried by hand, likely by thousands of people working over decades from borrow pits hundreds of yards away. This was a project on the scale of the Hoover Dam or the Panama Canal, but accomplished with nothing more than woven baskets and human muscle. What kind of social structure, what kind of authority is required to mobilize a population for a project of that magnitude? This was not the work of a gentle, egalitarian tribe. This was the product of a powerful, hierarchical, and likely coercive state. The evidence for this is all around the site. We have found the remains of a 2-mile-long defensive palisade, a wall of thousands of upright logs that enclosed the city's central ceremonial precinct. It was rebuilt 3 separate times, suggesting a constant threat of warfare. We have also found evidence of a society deeply stratified. The elites lived within the palisade, atop their private mounds, while the commoners lived in sprawling neighbourhoods of rectangular wooden houses outside the walls. The divide between the powerful and the powerless was written into the very geography of the city. And then there is the darker side. Excavations have uncovered mounds containing evidence of mass human sacrifice on a terrifying scale. In one mound, archaeologists found the remains of over 50 young women, all aged around 21, all buried at the same time, likely ritually executed. In another, they found the bodies of 4 men, their heads and hands cut off. Nearby was a pit containing over 40 men and women who appear to have been buried alive. This was a society that wielded the power of life and death over its subjects in the most brutal and public ways imaginable. Like the Hopewell before them, the Cahokians were also brilliant astronomers. Just west of Monk's Mound, archaeologists discovered a series of large post holes forming a massive circle 410 feet in diameter. They called it Woodhenge. Certain posts within this circle align perfectly with the sunrise on the solstices and equinoxes. It was a sophisticated solar calendar, allowing the rulers of Cahokia to track the seasons, predict agricultural cycles, and perhaps schedule the religious festivals that reinforced their power. The entire city was a machine for power, a cosmic engine designed to channel the authority of the sun and the sky into the hands of a ruling god-king. For 300 years, Cahokia was the center of the Mississippian world. Its influence, its culture, its religion spread up and down the river systems, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Satellite towns and smaller mound sites paid it tribute. It was the undisputed capital of a North American empire. And then, just like the Hopewell, it died. Around 1350 AD, the city was rapidly abandoned. Within a few generations, this bustling metropolis of tens of thousands was silent. The plazas grew over with grass. The wooden houses rotted away. The great mounds began to erode, slowly returning to the earth from which they were built. When the first French explorers arrived in the area in the 1600s, the local tribes had no memory of who had built the silent, colossal hills that dominated the landscape. The greatest city in North American history had been completely forgotten. Now we must take another leap, 1,000 miles to the southwest, into a landscape that could not be more different from the lush river valleys of the Midwest. We are in the high desert of New Mexico, in a place called Chaco Canyon. It is a harsh, unforgiving environment. Water is scarce. The summers are brutal, the winters cold. It seems like the last place on earth you would choose to build a civilization. And yet, for a period of about 300 years, from 850 to 1150 AD, this canyon was the absolute centre of the ancestral Pueblan world. What they built here is, in its own way, as staggering as Cahokia. Instead of earth, they used stone. They constructed what are known as great houses, massive, multi-storey structures of exquisite masonry that are unlike anything else in ancient North America. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, is an architectural marvel. It contained over 650 rooms, rose 4 or 5 stories high in places, and was laid out in a sweeping D shape. It was the largest apartment building in North America, until a new one was built in New York City in the late 19th century. The scale of construction is just the beginning of the mystery. The architecture itself is baffling. The rooms are often small and dark, with tiny high doors. Many rooms on the lower floors have no external doors or windows at all, and can only be accessed through hatches in the roof. It doesn't seem designed for comfortable everyday living. It feels more like a giant stone reliquary, a ceremonial centre, a place built not for people, but for gods or for the spirits of ancestors. And like the other sites, Chaco was a cosmic clock. At the top of Fajada Butte, a towering rock formation that dominates the canyon, is a site known as the Sun Dagger. Here, 3 massive stone slabs are propped against the cliff face. For most of the year, they cast random patterns of shadow. But on the summer solstice, a single sliver of light, a dagger of sun, appears and perfectly bisects a large spiral petroglyph carved into the rock behind them. On the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light perfectly frame the same spiral, and on the equinoxes, a small dagger hits a smaller, secondary spiral. It is an astronomical device of breathtaking ingenuity and precision. The buildings themselves are also aligned to the heavens. The major walls of Pueblo Bonito are oriented on a perfect north-south, east-west axis. Other great houses in the canyon are aligned to solar and lunar events. The entire canyon was conceived and built as a single integrated machine for tracking celestial cycles. It was a landscape-sized observatory, a place where the earth and sky were brought into perfect, harmonious alignment. But perhaps the most profound mystery of Chaco is the road system. Emanating out from the canyon in perfectly straight lines are the remnants of over 400 miles of engineered roads. These aren't simple trails. They were excavated, levelled, and often bordered with stone. They are typically 30 feet wide, and they run dead straight for dozens of miles, completely ignoring the difficult, broken terrain of the desert. They go up and over steep mesas, down sheer cliffs, not deviating from their path. From a practical, logistical standpoint, this makes no sense. A winding road that follows the contours of the land would be infinitely easier to build and to travel. These were not roads for commerce in the way we understand it. They were something else. They connect the central hub of Chaco Canyon to over 150 outlying great houses, smaller versions of the main canyon buildings scattered across the vast San Juan Basin. These roads were likely spiritual pathways, sacred causeways used for religious pilgrimages or ceremonial processions. They were lines of power, connecting the periphery to the sacred centre, mapping a spiritual geography onto the physical landscape. They were arteries for a belief system that we can now only guess at, and then Chaco followed the same haunting pattern. Around 1150 AD, a great drought hit the region. Construction stopped. The great houses were abandoned. The people sealed the doors of their stone cities and walked away, never to return. By the time the Spanish arrived centuries later, the canyon was empty. The local Navajo people, who came later, called the vanished builders Anasazi, a word often translated as ancient enemies. The memory was not just lost, it was replaced by something fearful, a warning to stay away from the homes of these powerful, mysterious ancestors. So here we have it, 3 distinct cultures separated by vast distances and hundreds of years, yet all following a similar, inexplicable trajectory. They rise from seemingly simple origins to achieve levels of social organisation, engineering, and astronomical science that are simply mind-blowing. They build on a monumental scale, reshaping the very earth. They create continent-spanning networks of trade and influence, And then one by one they vanish, leaving behind silent, enigmatic ruins and a profound, gaping hole in the historical record. This brings us to the core of the mystery. It's not just about who these people were or how they built these things. It's about why we know so little about them. Why isn't Monk's Mound as famous as Stonehenge? Why isn't the Great Octagon at Newark taught to every American schoolchild as a wonder of the ancient world? The answer is uncomfortable. It's because this history was not just lost, it was actively suppressed and erased. When European colonists first began pushing west across the Appalachians, they were stunned by the monumental earthworks they found. These structures were so vast, so sophisticated, that they simply could not believe they were the work of the Native American tribes they were encountering. The native peoples they saw were living in small mobile villages, decimated by diseases to which they had no immunity, and reeling from the social collapse that followed. In the colonists' minds, these savages were incapable of such grand achievements, and so they invented a story, a convenient fiction. The mounds, they claimed, were built by a lost white race. Perhaps they were Vikings, or the lost tribes of Israel, or survivors from Atlantis. This mound builder myth became incredibly popular in the 19th century. It was promoted by politicians, by writers, even by some early archaeologists. Why? Because it served a dark and deeply political purpose. If the mounds were built by some vanished white civilization, then the Native Americans living on the land were not the descendants of great engineers and astronomers. They were merely recent arrivals, interlopers who had perhaps even wiped out the true ancient builders. And if that were the case, then they had no ancestral, legitimate claim to the land. The mound builder myth became a core justification for the policy of manifest destiny and the brutal, systematic removal of native peoples from their ancestral homes. It was a historical lie created to rationalize a land grab. It was a tool of cultural genocide, erasing the genuine deep history of the continent to make way for a new one. Science eventually caught up. By the late 1800s, systematic archaeology, led by figures like Cyrus Thomas of the Smithsonian Institution, proved definitively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. But the damage was done. Generations of Americans had been taught the lie. The true history had been pushed so far to the margins that it never fully recovered. The erasure wasn't just ideological, it was physical. As the American nation expanded, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these monumental structures were simply destroyed. Farmers ploughed them flat to create more arable land. Towns and cities were built directly on top of them. The great mound city that stood where Nashville, Tennessee is now, was levelled. The city of St. Louis was built directly over a massive complex of 24 mounds, earning it the early nickname Mound City. All of them are now gone, buried under streets and buildings, visible only in old maps and drawings. We have been living on top of our own country's most spectacular ancient ruins, and in many cases we have paved them over without a second thought. What does this all mean? It means the story of America, the one taught in schools, the one that lives in the popular imagination, is fundamentally wrong. North America was not a wilderness. It was not an empty, virgin land waiting to be discovered. It was a continent that had been actively shaped, managed, and engineered by human hands for millennia. Before 1492, it was a world of cities, of nations, of empires, a world of vast agricultural landscapes, of sophisticated political structures, and of a deep, shared intellectual tradition rooted in the observation of the cosmos. What we are looking at with the Hopewell, Cahokia, And Chaco is not the full story. We are looking at a few surviving pages from a library that was burned to the ground. The diseases that swept across the continent in the 16th and 17th centuries were a demographic catastrophe unlike anything else in human history. As much as 90 to 95% of the indigenous population died. It was an apocalypse. It wasn't just people who were lost, it was knowledge. It was oral traditions passed down for 1,000 years. It was the memory of who built the mounds and why. The cultural chain was broken. The survivors were scattered, traumatized, and fighting for their very existence. The forgetting was not their fault. It was a product of a world-shattering cataclysm. When you start to connect the dots, a new picture of ancient America begins to emerge. It's a place of breathtaking complexity and deep time. What if these cultures were not as separate as we imagine? We see the trade goods, the obsidian, the copper, the shells that connect them physically. But what about the ideas? Is it just a coincidence that multiple, seemingly separate cultures across the continent all developed a sophisticated, observation-based astronomy and then chose to encode that knowledge in massive landscape-altering structures? Or are we seeing the faint echoes of a shared intellectual framework, a kind of scientific and religious paradigm that was adapted and expressed in different ways by different peoples across thousands of miles and thousands of years? We are just at the beginning of understanding this. New technologies like LiDAR, which uses lasers to map the ground from the air, are allowing us to peel back the forest canopy and see the faint outlines of structures that have been hidden for centuries. We are finding that these monumental landscapes are even more extensive than we ever dreamed. The Amazon, long thought to be a pristine jungle, is now revealing the ghosts of ancient cities and road networks. The same is happening in the American Midwest. We are realizing that the famous sites we know are not isolated wonders. They are the capitals, the central nodes in a web that is far vaster and more complex than any previous generation of archaeologists could have imagined. This changes everything. It changes our understanding of human potential. It tells us that writing, the wheel, and metal tools are not prerequisites for developing a complex, sophisticated scientific civilization. It tells us that there are other paths, other ways of knowing, other ways of organizing society that were just as valid and, in some ways, just as successful as the ones that developed in Europe and Asia. It also serves as a profound and humbling warning. These great civilizations, which lasted for centuries and commanded the resources of a continent, were ultimately fragile. They collapsed, whether through climate change, internal conflict, disease, or some combination of factors we don't yet understand. They fell. Their cities emptied. Their knowledge was lost. Their memory was erased. It is a testament to the fact that no society, no matter how powerful or sophisticated, is permanent. Civilization is a delicate experiment, and the ruins of these lost American worlds are a stark reminder of that truth. The ground beneath our feet is not just dirt, it is an archive. It is a library of lost stories. The great geometric earthworks, the silent pyramid cities, the ghostly desert roads, they are not just curiosities. They are the last, faint whispers of a world that was forgotten. They challenge our deepest assumptions about the past, about this continent, and about the nature of human history itself. They ask us to look again, to dig deeper, and to listen to the silence. The ghosts of this lost America are all around us, waiting to be rediscovered. The question is, what other secrets does the land still hold? And are we finally ready to hear them? And this fragility forces us to ask an even deeper question. What was the intellectual foundation upon which these societies were built? We see the monuments, the physical shells, but what was the ghost in the machine? What was the software running on this continental hardware? To understand that, we have to look past the dirt and stone and try to comprehend the sheer mental power at work. Consider again the Hopewell octagon, aligned to the 18.6-year lunar cycle. This isn't a casual observation. This is a multi-generational scientific project. No single person can observe the full cycle enough times to confirm its pattern with this precision. It requires a system, a tradition of passing specific, complex data from one generation of observers to the next without corruption. And they did this, as far as we know, without a written language. How is that possible? Imagine a priesthood of astronomers, a dedicated class of sky watchers whose sole purpose was to observe, record, and remember. Their memories were the hard drives. Their rituals were the software, encoding the complex celestial data into chants, dances, and ceremonies that were performed year after year, decade after decade. The construction of the earthworks themselves becomes the final printout. They were not just building a temple, they were building a textbook, a permanent record of their knowledge etched onto the surface of the planet itself, a message for the future, a message for us. This speaks to a fundamentally different relationship with the world. For them, mathematics, geometry, and spirituality were not separate disciplines. They were one and the same. The perfect circle was not just an impressive shape, it was a symbol of the cosmos, of eternity. The precise angles of the octagon were not just clever engineering, they were a way of harmonizing the human world with the divine clockwork of the heavens. They were practicing a kind of sacred geometry, a belief that the universe is written in a mathematical language, and that by recreating that language on Earth, you could bring your own world into alignment with a higher power. It's an idea that would have been perfectly familiar to Pythagoras or the builders of the Gothic cathedrals. Yet here it was, flourishing in the forests of ancient Ohio. Now, what if I told you that even this staggering story, starting with the Hopewell around 200 BC, is not the beginning? What if the tradition of monumental building in North America is thousands of years older than we thought? We have to travel south, down the Mississippi to the marshy lowlands of northern Louisiana, to a place called Poverty Point. And here, the timeline shatters. Built around 1700 BC, Poverty Point is a work of landscape art that predates the founding of Rome by 1,000 years. It predates the Parthenon. It is contemporary with Stonehenge in its final phase and the reign of Tutankhamun in Egypt, and its scale is almost beyond belief. It consists of 6 C-shaped earthen ridges, one nested inside the other, forming a colossal amphitheatre over half a mile across. These ridges, some of which were originally 6 feet high, were painstakingly constructed residential areas. Running out from the centre of this great curve are 5 earthen avenues, or aisles like the spokes of a giant, incomplete wheel. The whole complex is oriented with geometric precision to the cardinal directions. And here is the part that breaks all the old rules of archaeology. The people who built this were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers. They did not have widespread agriculture. The invention of the corn-based farming that fueled Cahokia was still 2,000 years in the future. According to the traditional story of human development, people like this are not supposed to build permanent cities. They are not supposed to undertake public works projects on a scale that would rival a modern construction company. And yet, They did. The sheer logistics are a nightmare to contemplate. Archaeologists estimate that the construction of Poverty Point would have required moving over 26 million cubic feet of earth, one basket load at a time. It would have taken the equivalent of 100 people working for 3 solid centuries without stopping. How did they organise this? How did they feed this workforce without large-scale farming? And why? What was the purpose of this colossal undertaking? We simply do not know. Like the later cultures, Poverty Point was the centre of an enormous trade network. The stone used to make their tools and elaborate carvings came from as far away as the Ouachita and Ozark Mountains, over 300 miles to the north. Soapstone for bowls came from the foothills of the Appalachians in Alabama and Georgia. Copper came from the Great Lakes region, over 1,000 miles away. This was a pilgrimage site, a trade emporium, a continental hub, existing at a time so deep in the past that it feels almost mythical. It proves that the great American experiment in civilization did not begin with the Hopewell or Cahokia. Its roots go deeper into a past so remote we can barely perceive its outlines. Poverty Point is the opening chapter to this lost book of American history, and we have only just begun to learn its alphabet. This theme of a shared world, a connected continent, becomes even clearer when we return to the era of Cahokia. We speak of Cahokia as a city, but that is like speaking of Rome without mentioning the Roman Empire. Cahokia was the capital, the undisputed centre of gravity, but it was not alone. It sat at the heart of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a vast network of interconnected chiefdoms, towns, and farming villages that stretched from Wisconsin to Florida. To see this, we can travel southeast to Alabama, to a site called Moundville. At its peak in the 13th century, Moundville was one of the largest and most powerful cities in North America, second only to Cahokia itself. Here, 29 massive platform mounds are arranged around a vast rectangular plaza. Like at Cahokia, the most powerful families lived on the summits of the largest mounds in the centre, while commoners lived in the surrounding village. It was a mirror of the capital, a provincial seat of power organised on the same cosmological and social principles. But what truly connects Moundville to Cahokia and to hundreds of other sites across the southeast is not just the architecture, it is the art, it is the symbolism. Digging into the graves of the Mississippian elite, archaeologists began to find a stunning and recurring set of images, a distinct artistic language carved into shell, embossed on copper and painted on pottery. They called it the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. We see figures of a warrior with wings, the Birdman, a being that can travel between the earth and the sky. We see a hand with an eye in the palm, a symbol of power and otherworldly perception. We see sun circles, feathered serpents, and skulls. For decades, these were just seen as strange, beautiful artifacts. But now we understand. This was the physical evidence of a shared religion, a common belief system that swept across the entire region. It was a state religion, a unifying ideology that legitimized the power of the ruling chiefs in every town. It was the glue that held the Mississippian world together. Finding these identical symbols at sites in Arkansas, Georgia, and Illinois is like excavating a medieval city in Poland and finding the same Catholic iconography you just dug up in Portugal. It is proof of a shared universe of meaning, a civilization bound by a common faith. This was no scattered collection of disconnected tribes. This was a world unto itself, with a capital, provincial centres, a shared language of art and religion, and a complex economy. And what powered this explosion of culture? What was the fuel that allowed these cities to rise and this religion to spread? The answer is a single plant, maize, corn. It was not native to the region. It was a technological import, a piece of sophisticated biotechnology developed over thousands of years by the peoples of Mesoamerica. When a highly productive variety of maize was finally adapted to the climate of the Mississippi Valley around 900 AD, it changed everything. For the first time, people could reliably produce massive food surpluses. More food meant more people. Populations boomed. With a surplus, you no longer needed every single person to be a food producer. You could have specialists, you could have priests, artisans, warriors, and most importantly, you could have rulers who controlled the surplus and used it to fund their ambitions. Maize was the energy source that made the entire Mississippian world possible. It allowed for the accumulation of wealth and power on a scale that had been unthinkable just a few generations before. The pyramids of Cahokia and Moundville are, in a very real sense, monuments built from corn. This new concentration of power had a dark side, a side that is written into the bones of the people themselves. Let's return to Cahokia, to a specific excavation known as Mound 72. From the outside, it is a small, unassuming ridge, easily overlooked next to the Colossus of Monk's Mound. But what was found inside is one of the most astonishing and disturbing discoveries in North American archaeology. At the very bottom of the mound, archaeologists found the burial of a single individual, a man who was clearly a paramount chief, perhaps one of the founding rulers of Cahokia. He was laid to rest on a cape or blanket made of over 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged in the shape of a falcon. This was an object of almost unimaginable wealth and prestige. The shells had to be imported from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles away, and the labour required to grind them into beads and sew them onto a garment is immense. This was a king, buried with the pomp and ceremony of an Egyptian pharaoh. But he was not alone. Buried with him and around him, in a series of deep pits, were the remains of over 270 other people. Most of them were sacrifices. There was a pit containing the bodies of more than 50 young women, all between the ages of 18 and 23, executed and buried together. There was another pit with 4 young men, their heads and hands cut off. In other pits, dozens of men and women were thrown in, some apparently buried alive, their fingers dug into the sand at the bottom of the pit in their final moments. This is not the gentle, harmonious society of popular myth. This is the chilling evidence of a state that held absolute, brutal power. These sacrifices were not random acts of violence. They were a form of political theatre. They were a public demonstration by the ruler that he held the ultimate authority, the power of life and death over his subjects. It was a way of sanctifying his own burial, of sending an entourage into the afterlife with him, and of terrifying his living subjects into submission. Mound 72 is the proof that Cahokia was not just a large town, it was an archaic state, built on the same foundations of divine kingship, social hierarchy, and ritual violence that we see in the birth of civilizations all over the world. Understanding this intense concentration of power also helps us understand why it all fell apart. A system built on such a rigid, top-down hierarchy is powerful, but it is also brittle. For a long time, the collapse of Cahokia around 1350 AD was a complete mystery. But now, a more complex and disturbing picture is emerging. It may have been a case of ecological suicide. Imagine the city at its peak, with 20,000 people living within its limits, and tens of thousands more in the surrounding farmlands. They needed wood. They needed it for their houses, for their cooking fires, and most critically, for the massive defensive palisades that ringed the city centre. Archaeologists have calculated that the 4 successive versions of the palisade would have required a staggering 80,000 logs. To get them, the Cahokians would have had to clear-cut every tree for miles around. This massive deforestation would have had catastrophic consequences. Without tree roots to hold the soil, every heavy rain would have caused massive erosion and flash flooding in the very creek that was the city's main water source. The loss of forests would have driven away the animals that were a crucial part of their diet. They were caught in a vicious cycle. The more successful they became, the more pressure they put on the very environment that sustained them. They may have been the victims of their own stunning success. And what happens when the floods keep getting worse, when the crops start to fail, when the game disappears? The people would look to their rulers, the god kings who claimed to mediate with the heavens, and they would ask why the gods were angry. A system whose legitimacy is based on ensuring prosperity and order is thrown into a crisis of faith when it can deliver neither. It is likely that the end of Cahokia was not a quiet fading away, but a violent, chaotic period of civil strife, political collapse, and starvation, as a society that had grown too large and too complex for its own environment simply tore itself apart. A similar story of a crisis of faith may have played out in the deserts of Chaco Canyon. The standard explanation is the great drought that began in the mid-11th century, and that is certainly a key part of the story. But was it just about food and water, or was it about something deeper? The entire Charcon system, the great houses, the astronomical alignments, the sacred roads, was an expression of a specific cosmology. It was a system designed to keep the world in balance. The rulers, the priests, the astronomers, their job was to perform the correct ceremonies at the correct times, as dictated by the sun and moon, to ensure that the rains would come and the world would remain in harmony. For over 200 years, it worked. The system flourished. But what happens when you do all the right things, perform all the correct rituals, and the rain still doesn't come? What happens when the drought lasts not for a year, but for a decade, and then 2, and then 5? It is more than a natural disaster. It is a theological catastrophe. It is proof that the system has failed. The gods have turned their backs. The rulers have lost their power. The abandonment of Chaco may not have been a simple migration in search of water. It may have been a conscious and deliberate rejection of a failed ideology, a spiritual revolution against a system that no longer kept its promises. The people sealed the doors of their great stone houses and walked away, not just from a place, but from a way of life. This idea of a spiritual, rather than purely practical motivation forces us to look again at those enigmatic Chacoan roads. The fact that they run in impossibly straight lines over punishing terrain has always been a puzzle. But what if we are thinking about them in the wrong way? What if their purpose was not to make travel easy, but to make a statement? A perfectly straight line is a human invention. It is an imposition of will, of intellectual order, onto a chaotic natural landscape. Perhaps the roads were not for moving corn or pottery. Perhaps they were for moving something intangible. Perhaps they were conceived as conduits for spiritual energy, connecting the sacred power of the central canyon to the outlying communities. Travelling these roads may have been a form of pilgrimage, where the physical difficulty of the journey, the straight, uncompromising path over cliffs and mesas, was part of the ritual itself. The roads were mapping a sacred geography onto the land, creating a massive, landscape-sized diagram of their cosmic beliefs. They were less like a highway system and more like a circuit board for a planetary religion, And what of the great houses that these roads connect? Many of the so-called outliers show very few signs of being lived in full time. They have the same grand architecture as the buildings in the main canyon, the same exquisite masonry, the same astronomical alignments, but very few hearths, very little trash, very few graves. They seem less like towns and more like empty temples, local embassies of the central Chakan faith. They may have been places where scattered dispersed communities, living in small farmsteads across the vast basin, would gather at specific, astronomically determined times of the year to reaffirm their connection to the centre. The road system and the outliers were the physical manifestation of a system designed to hold together a society that was spread thinly across a huge and difficult land. It was a work of social and religious engineering just as impressive as their stone architecture. When we put all these pieces together, the deep time of Poverty Point, the celestial mechanics of the Hopewell, the imperial grandeur and religious fervour of the Mississippians, and the stark spiritual geometry of Chaco, the picture that emerges is overwhelming. We're not looking at a few interesting but isolated archaeological sites. We are looking at the ruins of a truly distinct American antiquity, a complex tapestry of civilizations that rose, flourished, and fell on this continent over a period of 4,000 years. And we must consider what else we are missing. What lies under the forests of the Appalachian Mountains? What is buried beneath the plains of Kansas or the river deltas of the Gulf Coast? We are focused on earth and stone because that is what survives. But what about their achievements in other fields? What was their understanding of botany and medicine? What were their great oral epics, their philosophies, their legal systems? This was not a silent world. It was a world filled with ideas, with stories, with discovery. We see only the barest skeleton of what once was. The rest has been lost to time, to conquest, and to our own stubborn refusal to see what has been in front of us all along. The greatest mystery is not what these ruins are, but how much more of this lost world is still out there, waiting to be found. This quest for what's been lost often sends us looking for new ruins, new cities buried in the jungle. But what if the next great revelation is not about finding something new, but about re-examining what we've already found through a different lens? What if we've been blinded by our own assumptions about how a civilization is supposed to work? We have been telling the story of maize, of corn, as the great engine of change. But was it the only one? To answer that, we must leave the fertile river valleys and the high deserts and travel to the humid, subtropical tip of Florida, to the mangrove swamps and island chains of the Gulf Coast. Here, another kingdom rose, one that completely breaks the rules. We call them the Calusa, and for over 1,000 years they dominated southern Florida, building a complex, powerful, and stratified society with a paramount chief, a military, and an elaborate religious system. They had everything we associate with a state-level society. Everything, that is, except agriculture. The Calusa did not grow corn. They did not grow beans or squash. They were, in the classic archaeological sense, hunter-gatherers. But to use that term is almost insulting. They were masters of the estuary. Their civilization was built not on soil, but on the sea. They were expert fishermen, and they learned to harvest the staggering bounty of the coast with an industrial-level efficiency. They engineered a world for themselves, not out of earth but out of shells. Their capital, Mound Key, was not a natural island. It was an artificial one, built up over centuries from the discarded shells, bones and refuse of their daily lives. They literally built their world out of their own history. On these shellwork islands, they constructed massive ceremonial mounds, plazas, and the sprawling palace of their king. Spanish accounts from the 1560s describe this palace as a single structure large enough to hold 2,000 people without crowding. This was a metropolis built on the refuse of the sea. But their most stunning achievement was a feat of hydrological engineering. On Pine Island, a major Calusa centre, they dug a canal that ran for over 2.5 miles, straight as an arrow, directly across the island from one side to the other. It was 30 feet wide and nearly 7 feet deep in places, dug out of solid rock using nothing but shell and wooden tools. This wasn't for irrigation, it was a highway. It allowed their massive ocean-going canoes to travel directly through the island, avoiding the long and often dangerous trip around it. It was a strategic and commercial shortcut, a Panama Canal for a kingdom of fishermen. The Calusa are a profound challenge to our neat little boxes of human development. They prove that the agricultural revolution was not the only path to complexity. They demonstrate that a deep understanding of a local environment combined with brilliant social and engineering organisation could create a powerful and enduring civilization. They are a ghost in the machine of archaeological theory, a testament to a different way of being that thrived for centuries, powered by the tides and the rhythms of the sea. And this theme of mastering water, of bending it to the human will, takes on an even more epic scale when we return to the desert. We have walked the spiritual roads of Chaco, but about 500 miles to the southwest, in the brutal, sun-scorched basin of the Salton Gila rivers in modern-day Arizona, another people were engaged in a project that was, in its own way, even more ambitious. We call them the Hohokam. Between about 450 and 1450 AD, the Hohokam people built the largest and most sophisticated irrigation system in all of prehistoric North America. In a land that receives less than 8 inches of rain a year, where summer temperatures routinely top 110 degrees, they built a civilization based on farming, and they did it by literally reshaping the surface of their world. They engineered and excavated over 1,000 miles of canals. Think about that number, 1,000 miles. That is the distance from New York City to Miami. These were not simple ditches, they were massive public works projects. Some of the main canals were over 75 feet wide at the top and 15 feet deep, running for 20 miles or more. And here is the truly mind-blowing part. They were graded with an almost perfect, uniform precision. Over miles of desert, the canals drop in elevation at a rate of only 1 or 2 feet per mile. It is a gradient so subtle that it's difficult to perceive with the naked eye, yet it is the perfect speed to keep the water moving without causing erosion. How they achieved this level of precision without laser levels and modern survey equipment is a profound mystery. This network of canals turned the Sonoran Desert into a garden. It allowed the Hohokam to support a population in the tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, in one of the most inhospitable climates imaginable. They built large platform mounds like their cousins to the east, and they constructed huge, oval-shaped ball courts, a feature that screams of a connection to a world much farther south. They were terraformers, planetary engineers, who created an artificial oasis in the desert through sheer ingenuity and a staggering amount of coordinated labour. Unlike the others, around 1450 AD, their system collapsed and their great canal works filled with sand, the memory of their achievement blowing away in the desert wind. This mention of ball courts brings us to one of the most tantalising and fiercely debated questions in all of American archaeology. How much of what we see in these ruins is a purely local invention, and how much is an echo of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica. The Hohokam ball courts are almost identical in form, though not in construction, to those found hundreds of miles to the south in Mexico, where ritual ball games were a central part of religious and political life. The feathered serpent, a key deity in the Aztec and Maya pantheon, appears again and again in the art of the Mississippians. The very idea of building flat-topped pyramids as platforms for temples is a hallmark of Mesoamerican culture. The connections seem too obvious to ignore, and yet the evidence is frustratingly thin. We have found a handful of copperbells and a few species of parrots that were clearly traded up from Mexico. But that's it. We find no Maya pottery in Cahokia, no Toltec carvings in Chaco Canyon. So what are we looking at? Was there direct, sustained contact? Did flotillas of Maya trading canoes paddle up the Mississippi? It seems unlikely. A more probable, and perhaps more interesting explanation is a process of slow indirect diffusion. The ideas travelled, even if the people didn't. Imagine maize, the plant itself, moving north from Mexico, passed from one village to another over centuries. With the plant came the stories, the rituals, the cosmology that surrounded it. These ideas would have been like a whisper, changing a little with each telling, adapting to local beliefs, morphing as they crossed vast cultural and linguistic divides. The feathered serpent on a shell gorget in Alabama might not be Quetzalcoatl, but a distant, thrice-translated cousin of that idea, a concept that was reshaped to fit a new world. The platform mounds of Moundville were not a direct copy of a Maya temple, but the result of a shared, ancient idea about creating sacred mountains that elevate humanity closer to the gods. We may be looking at a ghost influence, a spiritual and intellectual current that flowed up from the south and provided some of the sparks, some of the raw ideological material that the peoples of North America then forged into something uniquely their own. It suggests a continent that was not a collection of isolated islands, but a single, interconnected intellectual ecosystem where ideas like seeds could drift for 1,000 miles and take root in new soil. This shared world was not just built on ideas and grand construction projects. It was held together by culture, by ritual, by shared practices that created a common identity across vast distances. And perhaps nothing illustrates this better than a game. It was called Chunky, and to the people of the Mississippian world, it was far more than a sport. The game was deceptively simple. A player would roll a small stone disc, which had been polished to a slick, almost frictionless finish, across a cleared, flattened field. As the stone rolled, 2 other players would run alongside it and throw their spears, trying to land them as close as possible to the spot where they predicted the stone would finally stop. It was a game of skill, of speed, and of incredible judgment. But it was also the social and political lifeblood of the Mississippian world. These were not casual pickup games. They were huge public spectacles, drawing crowds from miles around. Entire towns would wager on the outcome. Archaeological evidence suggests that people would bet their homes, their possessions, even their own freedom on the throw of a single spear. The games were a way of channeling the aggression and competition between towns and chiefdoms into a non-lethal, ritualized context. It was a substitute for war, a form of high-stakes diplomacy played out on a field of packed earth. The chunky stones themselves became objects of immense value and prestige. They were crafted with a jeweler's precision, often from exotic, colourful stone that had been imported from hundreds of miles away. They were so perfectly symmetrical, so flawlessly polished, that they feel almost alien to the touch. They were personal possessions kept for a lifetime and often buried with their owners as a mark of their status. Finding an identical style of chunky stone at a small village in Arkansas and in the heart of the capital at Cahokia tells us something profound. It tells us that these people, separated by hundreds of miles, were part of the same club. They played by the same rules. They understood the same social language. The game was a thread that stitched their world together. It created rivalries, but it also created relationships. It brought people together for trade, for ceremony, and for the shared thrill of the contest. It allowed a young man from a small outlying village to make a name for himself, to win prestige and wealth for his community, and perhaps even to catch the eye of a powerful chief. It was a social lubricant, a political theatre, and a sacred tradition, all rolled into one. When we imagine the great silent plazas of Cahokia or Moundville, we must not see them as empty spaces. We must imagine them filled with the roar of a crowd, the thud of running feet, and the fate of nations hanging on the arc of a flying spear. And this fragility forces us to ask an even deeper question. What was the intellectual foundation upon which these societies were built? We see the monuments, the physical shells, but what was the ghost in the machine? What was the software running on this continental hardware? To understand that, we have to look past the dirt and stone and try to comprehend the sheer mental power at work. Consider again the Hopewell octagon, aligned to the 18.6-year lunar cycle. This isn't a casual observation. This is a multi-generational scientific project. No single person can observe the full cycle enough times to confirm its pattern with this precision. It requires a system, a tradition of passing specific, complex data from one generation of observers to the next, without corruption. And they did this, as far as we know, without a written language. How is that possible? Imagine a priesthood of astronomers, a dedicated class of sky watchers, whose sole purpose was to observe, record, and remember. Their memories were the hard drives. Their rituals were the software, encoding the complex celestial data into chants, dances, and ceremonies that were performed year after year, decade after decade. The construction of the earthworks themselves becomes the final printout. They were not just building a temple, they were building a textbook, a permanent record of their knowledge etched onto the surface of the planet itself, a message for the future, a message for us. This speaks to a fundamentally different relationship with the world. For them, mathematics, geometry, and spirituality were not separate disciplines. They were one and the same. The perfect circle was not just an impressive shape, it was a symbol of the cosmos, of eternity. The precise angles of the octagon were not just clever engineering, they were a way of harmonizing the human world with the divine clockwork of the heavens. They were practicing a kind of sacred geometry, a belief that the universe is written in a mathematical language, and that by recreating that language on Earth, you could bring your own world into alignment with a higher power. It's an idea that would have been perfectly familiar to Pythagoras or the builders of the Gothic cathedrals. Yet here it was, flourishing in the forests of ancient Ohio. Now, what if I told you that even this staggering story, starting with the Hopewell around 200 BC, is not the beginning? What if the tradition of monumental building in North America is thousands of years older than we thought? We have to travel south, down the Mississippi to the marshy lowlands of northern Louisiana, to a place called Poverty Point. And here, the timeline shatters. Built around 1700 BC, Poverty Point is a work of landscape art that predates the founding of Rome by 1,000 years. It predates the Parthenon. It is contemporary with Stonehenge in its final phase and the reign of Tutankhamun in Egypt. And its scale is almost beyond belief. It consists of 6 C-shaped earthen ridges, one nested inside the other, forming a colossal amphitheatre over half a mile across. These ridges, some of which were originally 6 feet high, were painstakingly constructed residential areas. Running out from the centre of this great curve are 5 earthen avenues, or aisles, like the spokes of a giant, incomplete wheel. The whole complex is oriented with geometric precision to the cardinal directions. And here is the part that breaks all the old rules of archaeology. The people who built this were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers. They did not have widespread agriculture. The invention of the corn-based farming that fueled Cahokia was still 2,000 years in the future. According to the traditional story of human development, people like this are not supposed to build permanent cities. They are not supposed to undertake public works projects on a scale that would rival a modern construction company, and yet they did. The sheer logistics are a nightmare to contemplate. Archaeologists estimate that the construction of Poverty Point would have required moving over 26 million cubic feet of earth, one basket load at a time. It would have taken the equivalent of 100 people working for 3 solid centuries without stopping. How did they organise this? How did they feed this workforce without large-scale farming? And why? What was the purpose of this colossal undertaking? We simply do not know. Like the later cultures, Poverty Point was the centre of an enormous trade network. The stone used to make their tools, and elaborate carvings came from as far away as the Ouachita and Ozark Mountains, over 300 miles to the north. Soapstone for bowls came from the foothills of the Appalachians in Alabama and Georgia. Copper came from the Great Lakes region, over 1,000 miles away. This was a pilgrimage site, a trade emporium, a continental hub, existing at a time so deep in the past that it feels almost mythical. It proves that the great American experiment in civilization did not begin with the Hopewell or Cahokia. Its roots go deeper, into a past so remote we can barely perceive its outlines. Poverty Point is the opening chapter to this lost book of American history, and we have only just begun to learn its alphabet. This theme of a shared world, a connected continent, becomes even clearer when we return to the era of Cahokia. We speak of Cahokia as a city, but that is like speaking of Rome without mentioning the Roman Empire. Cahokia was the capital, the undisputed centre of gravity, but it was not alone. It sat at the heart of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a vast network of interconnected chiefdoms, towns and farming villages that stretched from Wisconsin to Florida. To see this, we can travel southeast to Alabama to a site called Moundville. Moundville was no mere outpost. It was a sprawling ceremonial and political centre, a true sister city to Cahokia, meticulously planned and populated by thousands. Imagine the sheer logistics, the shared knowledge, the profound cultural exchange required to maintain such an intricate web across a continent without modern communication. This wasn't a collection of isolated tribes, but a vibrant, sophisticated civilization, a true biological internet of ideas and goods, spanning colossal distances, echoing the ancient connections seen at Poverty Point. It forces us to confront a history far grander and more interconnected than our textbooks ever suggested. What untold stories still lie beneath our feet, waiting to challenge everything we thought we knew about the origins of complexity in the Americas. This vast, forgotten tapestry of ancient ingenuity beckons us to look closer, to question deeper, and to acknowledge the extraordinary legacy etched into the very soil we walk upon.